I came back from work one evening and didn't expect to find out that while I was gone, someone had dared to sneak into my home. But this wasn't just any stranger, it was Karen, the infamous HOA busybody who always found a way to cross every possible boundary. From the day I moved into the neighborhood, she had been a thorn in my side. She complained about the color of my shutters, tried to fine me for the length of my grass, and even yelled once because my American flag was too large. But this time, she had gone too far. What she didn't know was that my partner in security, my loyal K9, was waiting inside, and unlike me, he didn't tolerate intruders. The story of that night is burned into my memory, and when I tell it, I can still hear the sound of her scream echoing down the street. Earlier that morning, I had left the house with my mind focused on work. My German Shepherd, Max, stayed home as usual, guarding the property with sharp eyes and sharper instincts. Max had been trained during my years in law enforcement, and though he was retired just like me, his training never faded. He was loyal, alert, and incredibly protective. Whenever someone came too close to the house uninvited, he would perk up instantly. I had no idea Karen would make the mistake of testing him that day. Karen had been bitter for weeks because she had tried convincing the HOA board to enforce a ridiculous rule that large dogs should not be allowed in the neighborhood. She argued that Max was dangerous, even though everyone knew he was well trained and had never harmed anyone. The truth was, she didn't like that she couldn't control me the way she controlled others. Some neighbors gave in to her harassment, but I wasn't one of them, and that made me her prime target. From what I later pieced together, Karen had waited for me to leave that morning. She had likely been watching from behind her curtains, timing her move like a burglar. As soon as she thought the coast was clear, she strutted across the street with that self-righteous arrogance she always carried. But arrogance quickly turns into fear when you make the wrong move. Karen slipped into my backyard and used what looked like a master key. The problem? It didn't open my locks. She tried jiggling it, pushing, pulling, but Max was already on high alert inside. According to my security camera footage, Karen finally forced the door open slightly with some tool she had brought with her. That was the moment Max lunged. The video showed him sprinting across the living room the second the door creaked open. By the time Karen stepped inside, Max was already in her face with a deep growl that could make anyone freeze in their tracks. She screamed and stumbled backward, but Max didn't bite. He simply cornered her in the hallway, barking loud enough to wake the entire street. Meanwhile, I was still at work when my phone buzzed with an alert. My cameras had picked up movement in the house, and I quickly opened the feed. What I saw made my blood boil. Karen, inside my home, caught red-handed, frozen like a deer while Max kept her pinned. She was waving her arms and yelling, but Max stood his ground, his teeth bared just enough to warn her not to move. I immediately called the police and raced home, knowing that she had finally crossed the line that would end her harassment once and for all. By the time I pulled up, flashing lights had already arrived. Officers were outside, and the sound of Max's barking filled the neighborhood. Curious neighbors peeked from their windows and stood at the edges of their driveways, whispering about what was going on. It wasn't every day you saw the HOA president caught breaking into someone's home. Karen eventually stumbled out of my front door, escorted by 2 officers, her face red and sweaty, her usual smugness replaced with panic. The officers asked me to explain, and I showed them the footage on my phone. It was all there, her trying the lock, forcing the door, stepping inside, and Max reacting exactly as he was trained to do. There was no denying it, no excuses she could spin, no neighbors she could manipulate into siding with her this time. Karen tried to claim she was checking on the property for HOA violations, but even the officers laughed at that. She wasn't just trespassing, she was breaking and entering. The most ironic part? Karen had spent years telling everyone that Max was a menace, that he was dangerous and unfit for the neighborhood. Yet it was Max who had kept the situation under control. He didn't harm her, he didn't overreact, he simply did his job, protecting my home until law enforcement arrived. It was Karen who turned out to be the real menace. That night, as the police filed their report and Karen was escorted into the back of a patrol car, the neighborhood watched in silence. Some people actually clapped quietly, as if they had been waiting years for someone to finally put her in her place. And me? I just patted Max on the head, grateful for his loyalty, and felt a deep sense of satisfaction knowing that the nightmare of Karen's harassment had finally reached its breaking point. When I went back inside and replayed the footage again, I couldn't help but smile. The sight of her face when Max appeared will forever be a reminder of one simple truth: you don't mess with a man's home, and you definitely don't mess with his K9. That was just the beginning of the fallout, but in that single day, Karen's power over the neighborhood was shattered. She thought she could control everyone with threats and fines, but she forgot the one rule she could never break: my home was my castle, and Max was its unshakable guardian. After Karen was hauled out of my house in handcuffs, the story didn't just end there. In fact, that night was only the spark that set off a wildfire of consequences for her and the HOA she ruled over like a dictator. I'll never forget how the whole neighborhood buzzed for days afterward. People who had always been too scared to stand up to her finally found their voices. It was as if Max, my loyal K9, had done more than just protect my home. He had broken a spell of fear that Karen had cast on everyone around her. And the fallout that followed was unlike anything I could have imagined. The morning after the incident, I woke up to a dozen messages on my phone. Neighbors I barely knew were reaching out, thanking me for what had happened. Some said they'd seen the flashing lights and heard Karen screaming, and for the first time, they felt like justice had been served. One neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, who lived 3 houses down, told me Karen had once threatened to fine her $200 because her grandkids left sidewalk chalk drawings on the pavement. Another guy, Tom, said Karen had trespassed into his backyard last summer to measure his fence with a tape measure, then tried to write him up for violating neighborhood symmetry. Everyone had a story, and suddenly, they weren't afraid to share them anymore. Meanwhile, Karen was in a panic. She had been released on bail that night, but not without charges: trespassing, attempted breaking and entering, and harassment. For someone who prided herself on being the HOA president and community enforcer, her mugshot floating around social media was the ultimate humiliation. By noon, the local news had picked up the story. The headline read, "HOA president arrested after breaking into neighbor's home, stopped by residents K9." It spread like wildfire. Reporters camped at the edge of the neighborhood for a glimpse of her, and neighbors whispered about her downfall with a kind of glee that only comes after years of torment. I stayed calm through it all, but inside, I felt a surge of relief. For years, I had put up with her constant harassment: letters, fines, threats, even late-night phone calls where she'd leave voicemails about some imaginary violation. And every time I pushed back, she doubled down. But now, she had gone too far, and everyone knew it. The HOA board, which she had dominated like her personal kingdom, scrambled to distance themselves. They scheduled an emergency meeting, and I was invited to speak. That night, I walked into the community center with Max trotting beside me, his head high and chest proud. The place was packed. Neighbors who had never bothered attending before now showed up in droves, ready to see Karen face the music. When the board tried to start the meeting, people immediately began shouting about her behavior. One man stood up and demanded her resignation on the spot. Another woman said she wanted every fine she had ever paid refunded. The room exploded with complaints. Everything from her barging into backyards to threatening people with lawsuits. It was like a dam had burst, and all the pent-up frustration came rushing out. Karen wasn't there, of course. She had sent some weak apology letter claiming it was a misunderstanding, but no one bought it. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't have to say much. I simply held up my phone and replayed the security footage on the projector screen for everyone to see. The room went dead silent as they watched her forcing her way into my home and then screaming when Max cornered her. The silence was quickly followed by laughter, then outrage, then applause. People couldn't believe their HOA president, the one who constantly lectured them about rules and respect, had been caught violating the law in such a humiliating way. The board had no choice but to act. That night, they voted unanimously to strip Karen of her position as HOA president. It was over. The woman who had tormented this community for years was finally dethroned. The crowd erupted in cheers, and for the first time since moving in, I saw genuine unity among my neighbors. People shook my hand, patted Max, and thanked me for standing up when so many had been too scared to do so. But Karen wasn't done. A week later, I got a notice in the mail, a lawsuit. She was suing me for emotional distress caused by Max. She actually had the nerve to claim that my K9 had traumatized her, even though he had never laid a tooth on her. My lawyer laughed when he saw the papers. "She's grasping at straws," he said. "This case won't survive 5 minutes in court." And he was right. When the day of the hearing arrived, the judge dismissed her case almost immediately after watching the footage and reviewing the police report. The judge even scolded her for wasting the court's time. The fallout for Karen was brutal. Not only had she lost her HOA presidency in her lawsuit, but she also lost the support of nearly every neighbor. People avoided her on the street, whispered about her behind her back, and some even started petitions to have her removed from the community entirely. She had built her reputation on control and intimidation, but now she was nothing more than a cautionary tale. As for me and Max, life finally returned to normal, or at least a better version of normal. Neighbors began waving when I walked by, some stopped to chat, and a few even offered to help with small things around the house. It was as if taking Karen down had lifted a dark cloud that had hung over all of us. And Max? He became a local hero. Kids would run up to pet him, people brought him treats, and one family even made a little Medal of Honor out of cardboard and ribbon for him. He wore it proudly, tail wagging, completely unaware of the role he had played in changing the neighborhood forever. Looking back, I realized something important. Karen's downfall wasn't just about her sneaking into my house. It was about years of unchecked power finally coming to an end. People like her thrive on fear and silence, but once someone stands up, their entire empire crumbles. She had underestimated me, and more importantly, she had underestimated Max. That mistake cost her everything. Now, when I sit on my porch in the evenings with Max by my side, I sometimes think about that night. I imagine Karen's face the moment she realized she wasn't in control anymore, that she wasn't the one giving orders. Max had taught her a lesson she'd never forget: you can push people only so far before they push back, and sometimes, they don't push back alone. Sometimes, they have a 90-pound German Shepherd waiting right behind the door. And that's why, in the end, this story isn't just about an HOA bully getting what she deserved. It's about the strength of standing up, the loyalty of a good dog, and the truth that no matter how much power someone thinks they have, it only takes one moment to bring it all crashing down.